The cold, metallic click of handcuffs echoed in the quiet evening air. A successful, law-abiding man stood on his own front porch, humiliated in front of his neighbors, while two arrogant officers smirked, convinced they had just caught a brazen burglar. They never bothered to verify the address. They never bothered to properly check his identification. And when the chief of police heard the suspect's name over the radio, he didn't simply drive to the scene. He sped there in a blind, cold sweat of panic because these two officers hadn't just arrested an innocent man. They had handcuffed the one person who held the power to dismantle their entire department. On a crisp autumn evening in the affluent, meticulously manicured neighborhood of Crestwood Hills, the streets were lined with towering oak trees, and the driveways boasted imported luxury sedans. It was the kind of neighborhood where people paid a premium for silence, security, and predictability. Marcus Langford loved the quiet. In his late 40s, he had spent the last 2 decades building a formidable career in law and public service. He was a man who commanded respect in courtrooms and boardrooms alike. Tall, with broad shoulders and distinguished graying temples, he had recently moved into a sprawling colonial home on a quiet, tree-lined drive. The boxes were barely unpacked inside. That evening, Marcus had stepped outside in a cashmere sweater and tailored slacks to retrieve a package left at the edge of his property. The problem occurred when he turned to go back inside. The state-of-the-art smart lock on his custom mahogany front door had malfunctioned. A blinking red light mocked him as he tapped the passcode. The mechanism was jammed. Frustrated, Marcus sighed and set the package down on the porch. He pulled a small flathead screwdriver from his pocket, a habit from his days fixing up old cars in his youth, and crouched by the door, gently attempting to pry the battery casing loose to reset the system. It was a minor inconvenience, something that would take only a few minutes to fix. He didn't notice the twitching curtains across the street. Eleanor Whitfield, a longtime neighborhood watch captain with far too much time on her hands and an ingrained sense of suspicion, was watching him through high-end binoculars. She had lived in Crestwood Hills for many years and prided herself on knowing who belonged in her neighborhood. She hadn't seen the moving activity over the weekend while she was out of town. All she saw now was a tall black man in dark clothing crouching by the front door of the property she believed was vacant, appearing to pick the lock. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed her smartphone and dialed 911. "Yes, police, I need to report a break-in in progress," Eleanor whispered into the receiver, her voice trembling with manufactured adrenaline. "There is a man trying to break into the house. Yes, he's at the front door right now with a tool. You need to hurry before he gets inside." A short distance away, a patrol car was finishing a routine traffic stop. Inside were Officer Derek Harlan and Officer Nolan Pierce. Harlan was a veteran of the force, a man whose aggressive arrogance often compensated for his deep-seated insecurities. Pierce was younger, with little time on the street, and desperate to earn Harlan's approval. When the dispatch call crackled over the radio, "Suspect in progress, possible burglary," Harlan slammed his foot on the gas. "Finally, some real action," he muttered, the siren wailing as they tore through the quiet suburban streets. "Burglary in Crestwood. This guy is stupid." Back on the porch, Marcus had just managed to pop the casing off the smart lock. He removed the batteries, waited a moment, and popped them back in. A satisfying green light illuminated the keypad. He smiled, standing up and dusting off his knees. He reached for the handle. Suddenly, the blinding glare of a police spotlight washed over him, casting harsh, elongated shadows against the brick facade of his home. The screech of tires echoed through the quiet street as the cruiser hopped the curb and stopped aggressively at the end of his driveway. "Step away from the door. Hands where I can see them. Now!" The voice booming through the PA system was deafening. Marcus turned, shielding his eyes from the intense glare. He saw two silhouettes stepping out of the cruiser, their hands resting menacingly on the butts of their holstered firearms. His pulse spiked, but his decades of legal training instantly kicked in. He knew the statistics. He knew how quickly a misunderstanding could turn fatal. He took a slow, deliberate breath, keeping his movements smooth and telegraphed. "Good evening, officers," Marcus said, his voice calm, resonant, and steady. He raised his hands to chest level, palms open and facing forward. "There's no problem here. I'm just fixing my lock." "I said step away from the door," Harlan barked, unholstering his taser and advancing up the walkway. Pierce flanked him, hand still on his sidearm, looking nervous. Get down the stairs. Do it now. Officers, I am the homeowner, Marcus replied, taking one slow step down to comply. My name is Marcus Langford. I live here. My ID is in my back right pocket. Harlan scoffed, a nasty, cynical sound. Yeah, right. Homeowner. Down on the ground. Interlace your fingers behind your head. Marcus stopped on the bottom step of his porch. His calm demeanor remained, but his eyes hardened. Officer, I am complying with your orders, but I will not lie in the dirt of my own front yard. I have identified myself. I have offered you my identification. I suggest you take a moment to de-escalate and verify my residence. You don't give the orders here, pal, Harlan sneered, closing the distance. He grabbed Marcus's left arm with violent force, yanking him off balance. The physical contact was entirely unjustified. Marcus stumbled forward, but caught himself, his heavy frame refusing to be easily manhandled. This resistance, though entirely passive, triggered something dark and aggressive in Harlan. Stop resisting, Harlan yelled, the universal scripted battle cry of an officer looking for an excuse to escalate. I am not resisting, Marcus said firmly, though his heart was now hammering against his ribs. You are assaulting me on my own property. Pierce rushed in, grabbing Marcus's other arm. Together, the two officers shoved the man face first against the hood of his own car, a brand new charcoal gray Mercedes parked in the driveway. The impact knocked the wind out of Marcus. The cold metal of the car bit into his cheek. Neighbors were beginning to emerge from their homes. Porch lights flicked on like a wave up and down the street. Eleanor Whitfield stood at the edge of her lawn, arms crossed, watching with a satisfied smirk as the police handled the threat. Other neighbors, people Marcus hadn't even had the chance to introduce himself to yet, were pulling out their phones to record the spectacle. Legs apart, Harlan commanded, kicking Marcus's ankles to force his legs wide. He dug his knee into Marcus's lower back, pressing him painfully against the hood of the Mercedes. Check his pockets, Pierce. See what he stole. I stole nothing, Marcus said, his voice slightly muffled against the car, but still eerily composed. My wallet is in my back right pocket. My driver's license will show this address. The keys to this vehicle, which I am currently pressed against, are in my left pocket. Pierce hesitated, reaching into Marcus's back pocket and pulling out a sleek leather wallet. He flipped it open. The young officer squinted in the dim light. Harlan, his ID says Marcus Langford. The address matches. Harlan didn't let up the pressure on Marcus's spine. It's a fake. Or he stole the wallet from the homeowner and is using it to cover his tracks. You think I'm stupid? Guys like this don't live in houses like this. Marcus closed his eyes. The sheer, unadulterated ignorance of the statement hung in the crisp autumn air. Guys like this. The implication was crystal clear. With a brutal yank, Harlan pulled Marcus's arms behind his back. The cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists. They were ratcheted tight, too tight, biting instantly into the skin. You're under arrest for attempted burglary, trespassing, and resisting arrest, Harlan said, leaning down so his hot breath ghosted across Marcus's ear. You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you use it. They hauled Marcus upright. He stood there, handcuffed in his own driveway, illuminated by the flashing red and blue lights of the cruiser. He looked around at the small crowd of neighbors. Some looked concerned. Others looked validated. The humiliation was a physical weight pressing down on his chest. But beneath the humiliation, a cold, calculated fury was taking root. Marcus looked directly at Officer Harlan. The officer was grinning, proud of his collar. Officer, Marcus said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a chilling authority that made Pierce flinch. I'm going to give you one chance. Look at the ID again. Run my name through your dispatch system. You have a very short window to take these handcuffs off me, apologize, and leave my property. If you do not, I promise you, by tomorrow morning, you will no longer have a career in law enforcement. Harlan laughed out loud, a loud abrasive sound that echoed down the street. Oh, I'm shaking. What are you going to do, sue me? Get in line, buddy. I've dealt with 100 loudmouths like you. You're going to a holding cell. I am not a loudmouth, Marcus said softly, his eyes boring into Harlan. I am a man who understands exactly how the system works. And you, officer, have just made a catastrophic error. Get him in the back of the car, Harlan told Pierce, ignoring Marcus's warning completely. Pierce grabbed Marcus by the bicep and escorted him toward the cruiser. Before putting him in, Pierce pressed the button on his shoulder radio to call it in. "Dispatch, this is Unit 47. We have one in custody. Suspect is secured. Requesting a transport van." "Copy 47," the dispatcher's voice crackled back. "Can I get a name on the suspect?" Harlan grabbed his own radio. "Yeah, dispatch. Suspect is claiming the name Marcus Langford, probably an alias. We're bringing him in for processing." There was a pause on the radio, a long, heavy silence. Then the dispatcher's voice came back sounding noticeably tense. "Unit 47, please repeat the suspect's name." "Marcus Langford," Harlan said, rolling his eyes. "What's the holdup? Just log it." Another long pause. "Unit 47, hold your position. Do not transport. The chief is getting on the radio." Harlan frowned, exchanging a confused look with Pierce. "The chief? What the hell does the chief care about a burglary suspect?" A short distance away, Chief of Police Victor Langston was nursing a black coffee and a raging headache at a quiet diner. He had been the chief for several years. Lately, his job had been a nightmare. The state government had recently cracked down on municipal police departments, launching sweeping investigations into civil rights violations, excessive force, and municipal corruption. Crestwood Hills was squarely in the crosshairs. Just recently, the governor had appointed a new, highly feared special prosecutor, a man with absolute federal and state authority to audit local departments and bring down the hammer on systemic misconduct. Langston had been sweating bullets. He knew his department wasn't clean. He knew he had officers like Derek Harlan who were walking liabilities. The chief had been explicitly warned that the new special prosecutor was relocating to the area to begin a deep dive investigation into Crestwood Hills. The mandate was clear. One screw-up, one high-profile mistake, and the state would take over the department, fire the command staff, and strip them of their pensions. The radio clipped to Langston's belt squawked. He usually ignored standard dispatch traffic while on break, but the address caught his ear. One in custody at the exact property he knew had been quietly arranged for a high-profile VIP. Langston grabbed his radio, listening intently as Harlan's voice came through. "Suspect is claiming the name Marcus Langford." The blood drained from Chief Langston's face. His stomach bottomed out. A cold, icy dread seized his chest. Marcus Langford, the newly appointed special prosecutor, the man holding the keys to the entire department's future, the man who had taken down corrupt police forces in multiple major cities. And his idiot patrolman had him in handcuffs. Langston didn't even bother to key his mic at first. He scrambled out of the booth, threw money on the table, and sprinted out the door of the diner. He practically threw himself into his unmarked SUV, slamming the door and firing up the engine. He keyed his radio with a trembling hand as he flipped on his emergency lights and sirens, tearing out of the parking lot so fast the tires smoked. "Unit 47, this is Chief Langston," he barked into the radio, his voice cracking with raw panic. "Do not move. Do not put that man in the vehicle. Do not speak to him. If you have a hand on him, take it off right now. I am on my way. You hold your goddamn position." Back at the house, Harlan stared at his radio in utter shock. "The chief," Pierce whispered, his face going pale. "Why is the chief screaming?" I don't know," Harlan stammered, his arrogant bravado instantly evaporating. He looked from the radio to Marcus, who was still standing by the cruiser, hands cuffed behind his back. Marcus offered Harlan a cold, humorless smile. "I believe your window is up, officer." "Shut up," Harlan snapped, though his voice lacked its previous venom. Doubt was creeping in, insidious and terrifying. He looked at the wallet in Pierce's hand. He snatched it, looking closely at the driver's license. The picture matched. The address matched. He pulled out a shiny silver card tucked behind the license. It was a state credentials card, Marcus A. Langford, Special Prosecutor, Office of the Attorney General. Harlan felt his knees go weak. The color vanished from his cheeks. He looked up at Marcus, his jaw hanging open. You're... "I told you who I was," Marcus said softly, the flashing lights reflecting in his steady, unblinking eyes. "And I told you what was going to happen." For the next several minutes, the street was agonizingly silent, save for the idling engine of the police cruiser. The neighbors continued to watch, confused by the sudden standstill. Harlan and Pierce stood frozen, terrified to move, terrified to speak, terrified to even look at the man they had just assaulted. Harlan's hand hovered over the handcuff keys on his belt, but the chief's orders had been absolute. "Do not move. Do not touch him." Then, the wail of a siren pierced the night. It grew louder, faster, more frantic than a standard police response. A black SUV with hidden strobes blazing tore around the corner. It didn't brake gracefully. It slammed to a halt at a harsh angle, half on the grass, right behind the patrol car. The door flew open before the vehicle was even fully in park. Chief Victor Langston practically fell out of the SUV. He was breathless, his tie askew, his face a mottled, terrifying shade of crimson. He sprinted up the driveway, completely ignoring his two officers, and stopped directly in front of Marcus Langford. Langston looked at the handcuffs biting into Marcus's wrists. He looked at the dirt on Marcus's cashmere sweater. He looked at the red mark on Marcus's cheek, where Harlan had slammed him against the Mercedes. Langston closed his eyes, letting out a ragged, shaking breath. He knew with absolute certainty that his career and the reputation of his entire department had just ended. "Mr. Langford," Chief Langston whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of profound apology and sheer terror. "Sir, my God, I am so sorry." The silence on the street was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical hum of the police cruiser's engine and the frantic, shallow breathing of Officer Derek Harlan. Chief Victor Langston stood frozen on the concrete walkway, his eyes locked on the heavy steel cuffs binding Marcus Langford's wrists. The sheer gravity of the situation was crushing him. Langston was a veteran cop who had navigated political minefields for years, but looking at the special prosecutor bleeding slightly onto his own driveway, he knew there was no spinning this. This was a catastrophic failure. Langston turned his head slowly. The look he gave Officer Harlan possessed a lethal intensity. It was the look of a man watching his pension, his reputation, and his legacy burn to ash. "The keys!" Langston demanded, his voice a low, terrifying rasp that carried more menace than any scream. "Give me the keys right now!" Harlan's hands were shaking so violently he could barely operate his own duty belt. He fumbled with the leather pouch, dropping the small metal key onto the driveway. The clink against the concrete sounded like a gunshot in the quiet neighborhood. He scrambled to pick it up, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the crisp autumn air. "Chief, we got a call," Harlan stammered, his arrogant swagger entirely replaced by the pathetic whimper of a man realizing his life was over. "Dispatch said burglary in progress. He was at the door." "Shut your mouth," Langston snarled, snatching the key from Harlan's trembling fingers. He shoved the patrolman aside with enough force to make Harlan stumble, then stepped cautiously behind Marcus. "Mr. Langford, sir, I'm taking these off," Langston said, his hands visibly shaking as he inserted the key. Click, click. The steel jaws released. Marcus brought his arms forward slowly, wincing as blood flowed back into his hands. Deep, angry red indentations circled his wrists. He rubbed them methodically, turning around to face the three police officers standing in his driveway. "Chief Langston," Marcus said. His voice was not raised. It was perfectly level, devoid of any shouting or histrionics, and yet it cut through the night air like a scalpel. "I assume you are aware of who I am." "Yes, sir, I am," Langston replied, swallowing hard. "And I cannot begin to express how profoundly sorry I am for this catastrophic misunderstanding." "It was not a misunderstanding," Marcus corrected him, adjusting the cuffs of his cashmere sweater. "A misunderstanding is a misread address. A misunderstanding is a polite inquiry. What happened here was a blatant, aggressive violation of my Fourth Amendment rights. A stop executed without reasonable, articulable suspicion, followed immediately by excessive force, false imprisonment, and battery." Marcus took a step forward. Harlan instinctively took a step back, hiding behind the chief. "I identified myself immediately," Marcus continued, his eyes drilling into Harlan. "I informed your officer of my address. I offered my identification. In response, I was assaulted, slammed against my own vehicle, and mocked." Before Langston could formulate an apology, a high-pitched, self-righteous voice broke through the tension. "Well, it's about time someone did something about the crime in this area." From the edge of the property, Eleanor Whitfield was marching up the driveway. She wore a quilted robe and a triumphant smile, clutching her smartphone to her chest like a medal of honor. She had seen the chief arrive and assumed he was there to congratulate the patrolman on a major bust. "I'm the one who called 911, Chief," Eleanor announced proudly, stopping a few feet away. She glared at Marcus, then looked expectantly at the officers. "I saw him picking the lock. I knew he didn't belong here. Good job, boys. We have to keep our neighborhood safe. Chief Langston looked at the woman, his eyes widening in pure disbelief. He opened his mouth to yell at her, to tell her to get back in her house before she made things infinitely worse, but Marcus raised a single hand, stopping the chief in his tracks. Marcus turned to the neighbor. He offered her a polite, terrifyingly calm smile. "Good evening, ma'am," Marcus said smoothly. "I'm Marcus Langford. I purchased this property recently. I moved in this week." Eleanor's triumphant smile faltered. She blinked, looking from Marcus to the police cruiser, then to the chief, who looked as though he was going to be physically sick. That's impossible," Eleanor stammered. "The previous owners moved out. I didn't see moving trucks. My relocation was handled privately due to the sensitive nature of my employment with the state," Marcus replied, taking a step toward her. I sorry. The sheer authority radiating from him made Eleanor shrink back. "And you are the one who initiated the emergency response." I thought you were a burglar," she squeaked, her bravado evaporating. "Because I was fixing a jammed smart lock on my own front door?" Marcus asked, his tone inquisitive but heavily laced with legal peril. "Or because I am a black man standing in Crestwood Hills?" "That has nothing to do with it," Eleanor gasped, clutching her pearls in a gesture so cliché it almost made Marcus laugh. "It has everything to do with it," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a frigid whisper. "You bypassed a non-emergency inquiry and escalated directly to a 911 dispatch, providing false information of a crime in progress. Your reckless assumption just facilitated a gross civil rights violation." Marcus turned his attention back to Chief Langston, pointing a long finger at Eleanor. "Chief, please ensure this woman's information is recorded. I will be subpoenaing the 911 dispatch audio tomorrow morning. She is now a material witness in a federal civil rights inquiry, and I intend to explore civil litigation against her for initiating a false police report that resulted in my physical injury." Eleanor let out a sharp, panicked gasp. "Civil litigation? You can't sue me. I was protecting the neighborhood." "You will be hearing from my attorneys by the end of the week. I suggest you retain counsel," Marcus said dismissively, turning his back on her completely. Eleanor stood frozen for a second before spinning around and speed-walking back to her house in a state of absolute terror. Marcus looked at the two patrol officers. Pierce looked like he was going to cry. Harlan looked like a man standing on the gallows, waiting for the trapdoor to open. "Officers," Marcus said, "get off my property." Harlan didn't need to be told twice. He turned, grabbing Pierce's sleeve, and hurried toward the patrol car. "Not you, Chief," Marcus said softly as Langston began to turn. Langston froze. "You and I," Marcus said, gesturing toward the open front door of his home where the smart lock now glowed a welcoming, serene green, "are going to step inside. We have a great deal to discuss." The interior of the home was a stark contrast to the violence and chaos that had just unfolded on the driveway. It was impeccably designed, minimalist, elegant, with dark hardwood floors, vaulted ceilings, and abstract art hanging on the pristine white walls. The scent of expensive cedar and fresh paint lingered in the air. Chief Langston stood awkwardly in the grand foyer, feeling distinctly out of place in his rumpled uniform. He watched as Marcus Langford walked over to a wet bar tucked into an alcove, poured himself a glass of sparkling water, and took a long, deliberate sip. Marcus did not offer the chief a drink. He did not ask him to sit. "Mr. Langford," Langston began, desperate to seize control of the narrative before the silence suffocated him entirely. "I want to assure you, personally, that Officer Harlan will be suspended without pay, effective immediately. By tomorrow morning, I will have his badge on my desk. He will be terminated. Officer Pierce will face severe disciplinary action and retraining. I will personally oversee." "Stop talking, Chief," Marcus interrupted, his tone conversational but absolute. Langston snapped his mouth shut. Marcus walked over to a sleek, glass-topped dining table and rested his hands on it, leaning forward slightly. The ambient light from the chandelier cast sharp shadows across his face, highlighting the bruise forming on his left cheekbone. "Do you think I care about Derek Harlan?" Marcus asked, tilting his head. "Do you think firing one arrogant, hot-headed patrolman solves the problem?" Langston swallowed hard. "Sir, it was an isolated incident of poor judgment." "Do not insult my intelligence," Marcus snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. I have spent recent months reviewing the internal data of the Crestwood Hills Police Department. I was dispatched by the Attorney General because your department's use of force complaints have spiked sharply in recent years. Your traffic stop disparities are statistically indefensible, and your Internal Affairs Division clears nearly all civilian complaints without disciplinary action. Marcus took a step closer to the chief. Harlan is not an anomaly, Victor. He is the culture. A culture you cultivated, a culture you protected. He felt entirely comfortable assaulting a man who was completely compliant, completely passive, and who had already provided identification. Why? Because he knew you wouldn't punish him. Because he's done it before, hasn't he? Langston's silence was a deafening confirmation. I moved here quietly, Marcus continued, pacing slowly around the edge of the dining table like a predator circling its prey. I wanted to observe your department from the ground up before I initiated my formal audit. I wanted to see how this city operates when it thinks nobody is watching. Well, I got my answer on day 3. Mr. Langford, please, Langston pleaded, his hands sweating. If you take this public, if the Attorney General uses this to justify a federal consent decree, it will destroy the city. The mayor will gut the department. Morale will collapse. Morale? Marcus laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. You're worried about the morale of men who slam innocent homeowners against cars? Let me tell you what is going to happen, Chief. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen a few times and placed it face up on the glass table. That is a draft of the preliminary injunction I was preparing to file soon, Marcus said, pointing to the glowing screen. But tonight, you gave me a gift, a horrible, painful, humiliating gift. You gave me undeniable, first-hand, irrefutable evidence of systematic constitutional violations. The chief stared at the phone as if it were a live grenade. But here's the twist, Chief Langston, Marcus said, leaning in close. I don't just want a consent decree. Consent decrees take years. They get bogged down in bureaucratic red tape. I want immediate structural decapitation of your toxic command staff, and I have the leverage to get it. Marcus's eyes locked onto Langston's. I know about the internal audit regarding the disappearance of a substantial sum from the department's evidence locker, money tied to a local narcotics ring. The audit implicated 2 senior captains, both of whom were your closest friends. You buried the report to save your command staff. Langston physically recoiled. The color vanished from his face so rapidly he looked sickly pale. How could you possibly know about that? Langston whispered, his voice trembling. I am the special prosecutor, Marcus reminded him coldly. I don't knock on the front door. I come through the floorboards. I was going to use the audit to force your resignation in due time, but after what your boys did to me tonight, the timeline just accelerated. Marcus picked up his water glass and took another sip, letting the chief twist in the wind of his own impending destruction. Here is your ultimatum, Victor. Non-negotiable, Marcus stated, ticking the points off on his fingers. 1. Harlan is terminated tomorrow morning. Not suspended pending investigation. Terminated. I will personally file the criminal battery charges against him with the district attorney. You will not protect him. Langston nodded numbly. 2. Marcus continued, you will mandate the immediate implementation of the Civilian Oversight Board the mayor has been requesting, and you will grant them full subpoena power over your Internal Affairs Division. The union will strike, Langston protested weakly. Let them, Marcus countered instantly, because if they do, point 3 goes into effect. Tomorrow at midday, I will hold a press conference on my front lawn. I will release the body cam footage of my assault. I will release the 911 audio. I will release the findings of your racially biased traffic stops. And I will release the unredacted internal audit detailing how you, Chief Langston, covered up felony theft by your own captains. Langston grabbed the edge of the glass table to steady himself. His chest heaved. He was trapped in a perfect, inescapable checkmate. If he fought Marcus, he would be indicted and ruined publicly. If he complied, he would have to betray his union and his friends, tearing down the very power structure he had spent his life building. You're dismantling my department, Langston said, his voice hollow. I am performing a necessary amputation to save the patient, Marcus corrected him. You built a department that operates on arrogance and impunity. Tonight, you found out what happens when that impunity collides with someone who has the power to fight back. Most people Harlan slams against a hood don't have a badge shinier than his. I do. Marcus walked over to the front door and opened it. The cold night air rushed into the foyer. The police cruiser was still parked at the end of the driveway, its lights mercifully turned off. But Harlan and Pierce were still standing by the doors, waiting for their chief. "You have until early tomorrow morning to issue the termination papers and sign the oversight agreement," Marcus said, holding the door open. "If my phone does not ring by then, I call the press and I call the FBI." Langston walked slowly toward the door. He looked like a man who had aged years in the span of minutes. He stopped in the threshold and looked at Marcus Langford. "I thought I was a good cop, Mr. Langford," Langston whispered, a hint of genuine despair in his voice. "Somewhere along the line, I just wanted to protect my guys." "Your job was to protect the public," Marcus said softly, his tone devoid of sympathy. "You forgot the difference. Good night, Chief." Marcus closed the heavy mahogany door. The smart lock clicked, flashing a secure green. Outside, Chief Langston walked slowly down the driveway. Harlan stepped forward, his face tight with frantic hope. "Chief?" Harlan asked, his voice cracking. "What did he say? Are we okay?" Langston stopped. He looked at Harlan, the hot-headed patrolman who had just burned down his entire world. Langston felt a surge of rage, but it wasn't just directed at Harlan. It was directed at himself. "Give me your badge, Derek," Langston said, his voice dead and empty. "And your weapon. You're done." The squad room was mostly empty, smelling of stale coffee and old floor wax. Inside Chief Victor Langston's glass-walled office, the air was suffocatingly thick. 4 men stood around Langston's heavy desk. Officer Derek Harlan, stripped of his duty belt but still wearing his uniform, was pacing like a caged animal. Beside him stood Raymond Becker, the heavy-set president of the local Police Benevolent Association. Leaning against the filing cabinet with his arms crossed was Captain Malcolm Voss, one of the senior officers heavily implicated in the buried internal audit. Langston had just finished explaining the ultimatum Marcus Langford had laid out. He watched the varying degrees of panic and rage wash over the 3 men. "You've got to be kidding me, Victor," Becker spat, slamming a meaty fist onto the desk. "You're going to let some suit from the Attorney General's office come into our town, dictate our personnel, and mandate a civilian oversight board over a bruised wrist and a hurt ego? Absolutely not. The union will walk out." "It's not just a bruised wrist, Raymond," Langston fired back, his eyes bloodshot from a completely sleepless night. "It's false arrest, battery, and a massive civil rights violation on the special prosecutor sent here specifically to look for an excuse to gut us. He has the body cam footage. He has the 911 audio." "So what?" Harlan sneered, stopping his pacing to glare at the chief. "The guy got aggressive. He resisted. I used standard compliance techniques. The neighbor called it in as a burglary. We acted on good faith. Any judge in the county will throw out his little civil suit." "He doesn't need a county judge, Derek," Langston groaned, rubbing his temples. "He has the FBI on speed dial. And he's not just threatening you. He's threatening all of us. He knows about the internal audit." Captain Voss, who had been perfectly silent until that moment, suddenly stood up straight, the color draining from his face. He knows about the missing funds from evidence?" "He knows everything, Malcolm," Langston said softly. "He told me he'll release the unredacted audit to the press if I don't fire Harlan and sign the oversight agreement. If he does that, you and the other captain are looking at federal indictments, and I'm looking at serious federal time for conspiracy and obstruction of justice." The room plunged into a chilling silence. The bravado evaporated from Becker's face. He looked at Captain Voss, then at Langston, suddenly realizing that this wasn't about a union grievance. This was about survival. But Gary Harlan wasn't going to go down quietly. The narcissism that made him a terror on the streets now made him a cornered rat in the precinct. "No," Harlan said, his voice trembling with a dark, venomous rage. "No, I am not being the sacrificial lamb for your dirty money, Chief." "Derek, it's over," Langston pleaded. "I'll make sure the union gets you a quiet severance package, but you have to turn in your resignation." "Screw your severance package," Harlan shouted, stepping right up to the chief's desk. "You think you can just burn me to save your own skin? Let me tell you how this is gonna go. When you buried that audit, you and Captain Voss had a conversation in a squad car about how you were going to alter the evidence logs. You thought the dashcam audio was off. It wasn't. I was the one who checked the car back into the motor pool. I pulled the memory card. I've had it in a safe deposit box ever since. On the Cod and sail. Langston froze. The breath left his lungs in a sharp, painful hiss. Captain Voss physically stumbled backward, hitting the filing cabinet. You recorded us," Voss stammered, his eyes wide with terror. "I took an insurance policy." Harlan smiled, a sick, desperate grin stretching across his face. "So, here is my ultimatum, Chief. You don't fire me. You tell this Langford guy to go to hell. If he releases his audit, I release the audio of you and Voss committing a felony. If I go down, I am taking the entire command staff with me. Do we understand each other?" Harlan didn't wait for an answer. He turned and stormed out of the office, slamming the glass door so hard it rattled in its frame. Inside the office, Becker let out a long, low whistle. "Well, Victor, looks like you're stuck between a rock and a hard place." Langston sank into his leather chair. He had very little time before Marcus Langford tore his department to pieces, and now his own patrolman was holding a loaded gun to his head. The chief looked at his hands. They were shaking uncontrollably. The empire of corruption and protection he had spent years building was collapsing inward, crushing him under its weight. Early the next morning, Marcus Langford sat in the sunlit breakfast nook of his new home, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit. A steaming cup of tea sat on the table beside a stack of crisp legal documents. His tablet was propped up, streaming the local morning news. His phone buzzed. It was a Google alert for his own name. Marcus tapped the notification. It linked to the local paper's breaking news blog. The headline read, "Exclusive. Anonymous police source claims incoming state prosecutor used political clout to avoid arrest. Threatens local cops." Marcus read the article with a serene, terrifyingly calm expression. The article, clearly fed to a friendly reporter by Derek Harlan, painted a wild narrative. It claimed that police had responded to a legitimate burglary call, and that the suspect, Langford, had become violently uncooperative, verbally abused the officers, and then used his state connections to blackmail the chief of police into dropping the charges and forcing a good cop off the force. Marcus set the phone down and took a slow sip of his tea. He wasn't angry. He was deeply, profoundly satisfied. He had known Derek Harlan was a narcissist. He had profiled the man's disciplinary file for weeks. Narcissists never accept defeat. They always try to control the narrative. Marcus had banked on Harlan doing something incredibly stupid, and the patrolman had just handed Marcus the final nail for the department's coffin. At the appointed hour, a black SUV pulled into Marcus's driveway. Through the window, Marcus watched Chief Langston walk up the path. The chief looked like a dead man walking. His shoulders were slumped, his face ashen. Marcus opened the front door before Langston could even knock. "Mr. Langford," Langston rasped, holding out a manila folder. His hand was trembling. "Here it is, Harlan's termination papers, signed, and the mayoral agreement for the Civilian Oversight Board with full subpoena power, signed by me and the union president. We met your demands." Marcus looked at the folder, but he didn't take it. Instead, he held up his tablet, showing the chief the headline from the local paper. Langston squinted at the screen. As he read the words, the last remnants of hope drained from his eyes. No, I didn't authorize this. Harlan went rogue." "Your demands were simple, Victor," Marcus said, his voice cold and unforgiving. "Fire the officer, sign the agreement, and we handle this quietly. But your man couldn't keep his mouth shut. He tried to smear my name in the press to save his own skin." "Please," Langston begged, tears actually forming in the corners of his eyes. "I gave you what you wanted. Harlan has dashcam audio of me, of a mistake I made years ago. He blackmailed me this morning. I pushed his termination through anyway. I fell on my sword for you." "You didn't fall on your sword for me," Marcus corrected him sharply. "You did it because you were out of options. But the deal was absolute compliance and silence. Harlan broke the silence, which means the deal is void." "What are you going to do?" Langston whispered. "What I came to the city to do," Marcus replied. "I suggest you go back to your precinct and call a lawyer. A very good one." Marcus closed the door in the chief's face. At midday, the front lawn of Marcus Langford's home was transformed. News vans from every major network had descended upon the quiet, affluent neighborhood. Microphones were clustered on a podium set up in the driveway. Neighbors, including a horrified and deeply embarrassed Eleanor Whitfield, watched from their porches as state troopers secured the perimeter. Marcus Langford stepped up to the podium. The cameras flashed, a sea of bright lights reflecting off his immaculate suit. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his resonant voice commanding absolute silence from the press corps. "I recently moved into this neighborhood to begin my tenure as the special prosecutor for the state attorney general. While attempting to fix a broken lock on my own front door, I was racially profiled, falsely accused, and brutally assaulted by officers of the Crestwood Hills Police Department." A murmur rippled through the reporters. "However," Marcus continued, his eyes scanning the cameras, "this press conference is not about me. What happened to me is merely a symptom of a malignant disease rotting the core of this city's law enforcement." Marcus signaled to a state technician standing by a large monitor. The screen flickered to life, playing the body cam footage of Derek Harlan slamming Marcus against the Mercedes. The audio of the 911 call played simultaneously, Eleanor Whitfield's frantic, baseless accusations ringing out for the entire world to hear. The reporters gasped. It was undeniable, visceral proof. Officer Derek Harlan, the man in that video, attempted to leak a false narrative to the press this morning, claiming I was the aggressor, Marcus announced, holding up a stack of documents. But Officer Harlan is the least of this city's problems because the corruption does not end on the streets. It goes all the way to the chief's office. Marcus held up the thick-bound copy of the buried internal audit. "This is an internal audit buried by Chief Victor Langston. It details the systemic theft of a substantial sum from the narcotics evidence locker orchestrated by Captain Malcolm Voss and other members of the command staff. Chief Langston concealed this felony to protect his friends." The press corps erupted into a frenzy of shouted questions. "Effective immediately," Marcus stated, raising his voice over the chaos. "I am filing federal civil rights and criminal battery charges against Derek Harlan. I am officially handing the internal audit over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and I am filing an emergency petition with the state Supreme Court to place the Crestwood Hills Police Department under immediate federal receivership." As Marcus spoke, the cameras caught a flurry of movement down the street. Black FBI Suburbans were rolling slowly toward the precinct downtown. "No one is above the law," Marcus concluded, looking directly into the main broadcast camera. A promise etched into his unyielding expression, "especially not those who wear a badge to enforce it. Thank you." That afternoon, Chief Victor Langston and Captain Malcolm Voss were walked out of the precinct in handcuffs by federal agents. By evening, Derek Harlan was arrested at his home, crying as the metal cuffs snapped around his wrists, a sharp, ironic echo of the pain he had inflicted the night before. And by evening, as the sun set over Crestwood Hills, the neighborhood was quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet. Eleanor Whitfield's curtains remained firmly drawn, her reign of paranoid terror permanently shattered. The residents who had watched the abuse in silence now realized that accountability had finally moved in next door. Marcus Langford sat on his porch, watching the twilight settle. The smart lock glowed a peaceful green. The battle for the city had just begun, but the first strike was a flawless, devastating victory. He took a sip of his tea, finally enjoying the quiet. The abuse of power thrives in the dark, relying on silence and fear to protect those who wear the badge as a shield for their own ego. But as this story proves, true authority doesn't come from a uniform or a pair of handcuffs. It comes from the relentless, uncompromising pursuit of justice. Marcus Langford turned his darkest moment into a masterclass on dismantling a corrupt system from the inside out. If this story of accountability and triumph had your heart pounding, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video, share it with your friends to spread the message, and subscribe to our channel for more intense real-life drama stories where justice always gets the final word.